22nd numbers of Psalms.
Psalm 22, we're going to start at verse 1. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Far from my deliverance are the words of my groaning. O my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I have no rest. And then the A portion of verse 3, which says, but thou art holy.
Yes.
As a thought this morning I'd like to use, going through holy hell. Going through holy hell. The 22nd Psalm is not as famous as the first verse of this psalm is. Most of us are relatively familiar with the first verse. Many of us, in fact, perhaps thought that these words in our reading first flowed from the lips of Jesus while on the cross. And we are just now learning that it was not an original statement from the cross of Calvary, but rather Jesus was speaking the words from a psalm of David. Brothers and sisters, before it was a cry from the cross, it was a song of David. It came at a time when David was feeling alone, abandoned, deserted, isolated, and desolate. It came at a time when David felt that God had left him all by himself. It is a feeling for David in particular of abandonment, because David was following God. This cry stems from the fact that not only does David feel alone, but also because he feels that he wouldn't even be in this predicament had he not been following God. Can we be honest here this morning? Have you ever followed God's directions and found yourself in some kind of a mess? Or some kind of a dilemma between a rock and a hard place? Are you going to pray with me this morning? Have you ever followed Christ only to find yourself in some situation or circumstance that is so uncomfortable and demanding, so much of a living hell, that you wonder how you ever got there and why do you feel so alone? I mean, after all, here you are walking down the paths of righteousness for his name's sake, following Jesus, only to find yourself in the valley of the shadow of death. I tell you, church, sometimes it's hard to accept that God can still be with you when the darkness falls and the trials and tribulations are all over and around you. Sometimes, church, it is hard to believe that God would lead us to such a place that is so burdensome and heavy laden. Can I get a witness this morning? I know I'm not the only person here to ever doubt God's reasoning. I know I'm not the only person here to ever question God's will, God's purpose, or God's plan. Y'all gonna pray with me or what? I know, brothers and sisters, that I'm not the only person here to ask God why. Why am I in this mess? Why, God, does the ungodly seem to prosper and my way seems to be so hard? Why, God, am I always suffering? Why, Lord, is it always some kind of trouble in my way? My God, why hast thou forsaken me? By way of introduction, El Bethel, to really get the understanding of this passage, you must first take it out of its Christological context. You see Jesus in the light of the psalm, and not the psalm in the light of Jesus. You see, church, whenever someone in the New Testament quoted someone from the Old Testament, it was because of what the Old Testament author meant when they wrote it. So in order to really understand this psalm, you really can't talk about what Jesus was going through when he said it. You've got to understand what David was going through when he said it. Are you with me this morning? It is a cry for help. It is a cry for deliverance out of something that you never would have been in if you had not been following God. Even though God never promised us an easy road. All through history, following God has led people to hard trials and persecution. 2 Timothy 3:12 tells us all who will live godly shall suffer persecution. Daniel, in following God, found himself in a lion's den with some hungry lions. The 3 Hebrew boys, in following God, found themselves being cast into a fiery furnace. Paul wound up in a jail and ultimately put to death. Stephen was stoned to death. Elijah found himself an outcast. Job lost everything. James was put to death with the sword. John the Baptist was beheaded. The Apostle John was exiled to the Isle of Patmos. Isn't it amazing that sometimes it appears that following God has gotten us into more messes and more hardships and more trouble than you could ever have imagined before you decided to follow him. Isn't it amazing, church, that sometimes in following Christ, that you wonder if you somehow gotten off course somewhere because of where you found yourself was not at all what you expected. And it seems like you are going through this hell all by yourself. Hopeless and helpless. Now understand, church, when David cries, "Why hast thou forsaken me?" he is not talking about the absence of the presence of God. We know that because he's talking to God. But what David is talking about is the presumed inactivity of God. The spirit of the text suggests that David felt that God was ignoring him. And the reason he was feeling ignored was because he was calling on the Lord and was not receiving the attention or the answers that he was looking for. Plus, he couldn't see any benefit for what it was he was going through. He didn't see any reason for these trials and tribulations. Am I talking to anyone here this morning? Herein is a war between the flesh and the spirit. Between what the spirit knows and what your flesh has to see and feel. David felt that if God heard him, God should be doing something. David had equated activity with acknowledgement. In other words, David knew God heard him, but because he didn't see anything happening, because he seen no activity on God's part, David felt that God had forsaken him. Brothers and sisters, just like us, David felt that if God is not doing something, then God is not up to anything. Are you still praying with me? Church, God is at work even when we don't know he's at work. God can be moving even if you don't see God moving. God can be working in your life even if you don't feel like he's working in your life. God's ways are not our ways. David says, "Why art thou so far from helping me and from the words of my roaring? Oh my God, I cry in the daytime, but thou hearest not. And in the night season, and am not silent. I am constantly calling on you. I'm fasting and praying, yet nothing happens. I've been praying night and day, and you are not responding. Church, have you ever prayed and nothing seemed to be happening? Come on now. Have you ever prayed and nothing seemed to be changing? Has anyone other than me ever felt like God didn't care? Or that God had turned a deaf ear on our pleas? Has anyone else ever felt like if God doesn't show up when we want him to, then God is not going to show up at all? Can we be honest this morning?